So yeah, I mean, it literally is a third of the century. I got into this in my first exposure to what carbon markets were was in the spring semester of 1993 when I was doing my PhD, and I was working on environmental markets. And before I was working for a professor we done for who was my advisor basically, and I was his research assistant looking at market-based solutions to environmental problems. And we did things like road pricing, we did things like non-price barriers to solar and things like that, all in Los Angeles. Some stuff about reclaim down in Los Angeles. And the fourth thing we did was on using forestry to compensate for greenhouse gas emissions. And this was sort of what he called a clinic program, where I was the research assistant. In that case, I was a research assistant and I was taking the class along with five other people. And the idea was you come up with sort of a graduate student type McKinsey type report at the end about what these things are for a policymaker to read. And that's how I got exposed to it in sort of January of 1993. And by June of 93 I was presenting at the World Bank, and by December of 1993 I was doing a USAID mission to Thailand on forestry on reforesting for the King of Thailand. So basically it started as with a rush and kind of never slowed down.
Welcome back to This Week in Carbon. I'm your host, Eddie Smith, here with my co-host, Rene Velasquez. And today we're joined by Marc Stuart, a veteran in the carbon markets. Marc is the founding managing partner of Allotrope Partners and longtime serving current board chair of Vera. Marc has been in the space since 1993, so I think it'd be great to start out and learn about your background and introduce you to the audience. What did the carbon markets even mean back then when you were initially beginning?
It's a very good question. I mean, so basically the first carbon projects you probably know this, were done by Applied Energy Services, AES, started in 1989, and they hired the World Resources Institute to basically go out there and find projects around the world that could reduce emissions. And nobody knew exactly what that meant. And that was Mark Trexler, who basically ran that whole program at WRI. And what that meant is, so WRI collected, I think, from landfills and forestry and God knows what else. I was not involved at this point, obviously, and they selected 3 projects to basically invest in to create nominal carbon credits. And at that juncture, again, there were no methodologies. Of course, there were no. It was basically, it was basically you bilaterally determined between the buyer and the seller, or the investor and the investee, whatever you call, what a carbon credit was, what you were measuring, basically. And so at the earliest stages, this was where that was obviously not a particularly effective way to channel capital, because nobody could do anything speculatively. You had to wait for a buyer to show up and come up with your idea and hope that he did it. And so that was really what it was, for the beginning. And one of the things we'll get to a little bit later is when we started EcoSecurities, we addressed that quite directly, and when the first thing EcoSecurities ever did. But so I got involved, through graduate school, got involved with the guy who brokered one of the first projects in Malaysia for New England Electric, and worked for him for a couple of years. And then at the same time, the FACE Foundation from the Netherlands was out there doing reforestation. So there were a handful of groups doing this, but it was all based upon just, we're going to agree what we're measuring that creates a carbon ton, basically.
Yeah. And when you co-founded EcoSecurities, so let's talk about that. In 1997, right? I believe.
96, 97. We formally incorporated in January of 97.
And what was the thesis behind that? What did you believe was possible that others maybe didn't see yet?
Well, it started with a single project. At a certain point, my co-founder, Pedro Maracosta, was sort of hanging around with SGS Forestry in Oxford. His wife was working there, and he was around. And he had been the FACE Foundation's implementer on the ground for their reforestation project in Malaysia, which was by FACE. And I was on the same concession working with New England Electric on their reduced impact logging project. So Pedro and I got to know each other. Both were sort of moving on our way from where we had been, employed before and figuring out what was next. I had gotten a letter from, I believe it was a fax actually, from a guy at SGS suggesting that what the world needed was a third-party certification system, and for carbon credits. And I immediately sort of said to my boss at the time, "This is the most important letter we've ever gotten." And he said, "I don't get it." I'm like, "Okay, well." And so Pedro and I, a few months later, again, I was sort of temporary. I hadn't been paid for a while, to be perfectly blunt. So Pedro and I were doing our own thing, and we sent a proposal to SGS to build a third-party certification system. And bluntly, they sort of laughed at us and said, "Yeah, we don't need that." And then a few months later, we got involved with one of the very first. You've never heard of something called the U.S. Initiative on Joint Implementation, USIJI, which is one of the first government programs to sort of look at carbon directly. And there were 7 proposals to the first USIJI round in 1994, 1995. I wrote 4 of them. So, again, so I was, there from the beginning, a couple in Malaysia, a couple no, 2 in Malaysia, 1 in Fiji, and 1 in Costa Rica, which I did for Cristiano Figueres' group at the time, Center for Sustainable Development in the Americas. And so one of the projects that I didn't do, which was in Costa Rica, which was the Fundacor project, hired SGS to do a Forest Stewardship Council FSC certification of their timber. And because they were partially funded by carbon, or purportedly funded by carbon, SGS decided they needed some carbon expertise there. So they, Pedro was sitting around there and said, "Oh yeah, Pedro," and Pedro said, "You have to bring Marc to be the environmental economist." And so we go down there and we tromp around the forest. I've been around enough tropical forests at the time to know what I was doing around logging and things along those lines, to know what was good, sustainable logging and things like that. At the end of the project, SGS is giving their report, and the Costa Rican person, Franz Stottenbach, who is, I believe, still the current Minister of the Environment for Costa Rica, but Franz was running the Fundacor project at the time. Franz says, "Well, this is all well and good, but what I really wanted you guys here is Costa Rica is going to sell carbon on the Chicago Board of Trade. The World Bank wants us to get a certification agency to certify our carbon. They've given us a large amount of money to do that. I want SGS to do this." And lo and behold, the 2 guys who had basically made this proposal to SGS like 3 or 4 months before were literally in the room when that was said, and we're like, that seems like a good idea. But basically, SGS, had to, the World Bank, Chicago Board of Trade. This all sounds very serious, but they have no idea what they're talking about. So they come to us and and say, "Okay, let's talk about this proposal of yours." And in the end, we formed EcoSecurities on the basis of building the first forestry-based certification program for carbon, basically for SGS. But instead of just doing it for SGS, we said, "Well, we're gonna build it ourselves. We're gonna license it to you." And they said, "Okay, but then you have to form a company." And that was what became EcoSecurities. That was EcoSecurities. So, but I think that the what we saw about that was that third-party certification made speculative capital possible. You didn't have to basically wait for somebody to come in and order the loaf of bread to start baking, basically. If you had third-party certification, in theory, this was the unlock, in theory, around how to, people could make investments in projects. So I think that was our, people come to us and say, "Oh, so you guys want to be certifiers?" And we'd say, "No, we have absolutely no desire to be certifiers, but we know that there's an absolute need for certification." And so, it was a good story at the time. We worked like crazy for, 12 months, because that was the 12 months before Kyoto, where, Costa Rica was going to announce their big program. And then lo and behold, Kyoto kicks forests out of the whole program, and it wasn't worth anything at that juncture. So that's the origin story.
Yeah.
So can you take us through the evolution of then that story? What happens next?
Okay,
That's
so
fascinating.
As I've often said, in the land of the blind, one eye, even if it's myopic, is pretty good. So basically, we got the reputation. The interesting thing was SGS, sent us around the world basically marketing this new program during 1997 while we were building it. So, going to these conferences, I had some work in Papua New Guinea. I stopped by the, government of Australia. They have this new greenhouse gas program. They're like, oh, would you guys advise us on this? And I'm not handing out the SGS card. I'm handing out the EcoSecurities card at this point, basically. So they basically gave us our initial sort of world marketing tour. And then we started, and each of us had some work around carbon. I was doing some work for the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. I'd done some work from Enron at the time. I was doing some work for Southern California Edison, UNDP. Pedro had some other work. And we just sort of had tossed all of our respective work into the kitty and said, we're partners, let's see what happens, basically. And so then we just started getting the reputation and just started, and over the next several years, we worked for development agencies, we worked for the banks, we worked for industry associations, we worked for governments. By 2004, 2005, when we were getting ready to go public, we'd worked in 70 countries, and we'd worked with everybody up and down the whole ecosystem that was working on carbon. Because again, we had one eye open, and we had the impression of, or the people had the impression we were clever, and so we built sort of a consulting team around that of about 20, 25 people, offices in the U.S., the UK, Netherlands, and Brazil. But yeah, it was all basically around the consulting of all the pieces of what were becoming the carbon market, basically. And in part of that case, we were working for people that were trying to put their projects into these various funds that had cropped up. The prototype carbon fund is the one that's most famous, but the Dutch had funds, the Austrians had funds, the Japanese had funds, the IFC had funds, German had funds, all for basically sort of seeding this carbon market. So, landfills and energy projects and other things would come to us and say, "Can you help us get us into these purchase agreements?" And we would offer to do that. And generally, we would want to take some of the tons as part of our payment because they didn't want to pay our full cash rate because nobody knew what these things were. But over time, we kind of built a prospective portfolio. And when that portfolio turned out to be valuable, that was a good day.
So that was sort of driving the growth of EcoSecurities.
Yeah. Yeah, we were just in the flow of everything, known as the people. We were the pure play in carbon. Lots of other people were coming from existing platforms, the accounting firms and the energy firms, et cetera. But we were a pure play carbon firm. We're living and dying with this, and But again, we did we wrote a lot of reports. We churned paper out like an enormous amount those years, but that gave us an incredible network, and it gave us an incredible knowledge base. And when the market turned, when Kyoto got ratified and the UETS came in board, we were in a great position.
Yeah, and then kind of fast forwarding to the structural, when you started to see, you mentioned you saw some structural weaknesses, right, in the markets, and I would kind of love to hear about that kind of boom, kind of bust story that people often talk about back then.
I mean, this will be a theme I think we cover multiple times in this interview. It's all markets only work if you have reasonably balanced supply and demand. And throughout the entire problem with the carbon markets forever is that we have virtually unlimited amounts of supply and not nearly enough demand in theory, basically. And I think that in particular the CDM in particular. And again, I don't think there were structural problems with the CDM. I mean, there was operational issues with the CDM. What we saw in what you guys are familiar with, sort of from the last 5 or 6 years in terms of delays and stuff like that. What our business model changed when we took EcoSecurities public was we basically took on all the costs of developing a project. Soup to nuts, basically, in terms of the carbon side, including paying the validators, doing all of our own work, et cetera, and we would only get paid on the back end when the credits were issued, and in that case we were generally buying the credits either for a fixed price or a floating price, but at a certain point, when projects have been sort of turning in 90 days through the executive board, and all of a sudden it was 500 days. And that's a real problem when you're basically laying out cash and you need to get cash back and you have uncertainty around that. So there was always sort of some, same issues that we saw, later with, Vera and Gold Standard later on about, just, structural problems. We had that with the CDM. I mean, this is a rerun to me. It's kind of ironic because back in 2007, my job was to yell at the CDM executive board at every opportunity I could, basically just, in public forums, going to them. But at the time, there was literally no way that a project developer could actually talk to the CDM executive board as secretariat. Everything had to go through the validator. So you were, playing these phone tag conversations, which was just absurd. And, I managed, along with a couple other folks from the industry to break through that and create a direct access point to the executive board at the time. But, again, so that was the structural problem from an operational perspective. But the structural problem, from a markets perspective was the ETS was our primary driver. And, frankly, when we went into a major recession, starting with the great financial crisis in 2000, starting late 2007, then 2008, and frankly, economic activity in Europe, particularly Southern Europe, crashed. There was no mechanism to change the demand. And at this point, there was way too much. There was too much supply for demand, and eventually that brought the whole market, a little bit after 2010 to basically zero, or really close to zero, because even though it was only oversupplied by a couple percent in an environmental market that you can't store anything in is basically a zero price. So. There was no mechanism within the first ETS to basically account for extraneous variables such as major economic, downturns to keep the price of carbon up. I'd say that was one particularly strong structural problem at the first. And again, I will go back to this over and over in this interview. All of our problems are based on basically misaligned supply and demand.
Yeah. And,
Yeah.
Rene, you want to jump in here?
Well, I completely agree, and I want to come back to that. But can we go back to the sort of the story arc of EcoSecurities, because you talked about obviously the GFC, right? 2007 tail end, 2008, but the market still ran for a while, and then historically, EcoSecurities still ran for a while, and then there was an acquisition on the JP Morgan side.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you take us through this kind of boom piece,
Okay, so,
the transition into JP Morgan, and then what happens after?
Well, let's start at the beginning. So basically, in sort of late 2004, early 2005, the phone calls start changing. They're not coming from the landfills and the wind energy guys and things like that. They're coming from Shell and from Eon and from Tokyo Electric. They're going, hey, you guys, you have some carbon credits. We think we're going to need some. And we're like, this is interesting. And I'll be perfectly honest. I missed this turn of the thing. This was Pedro and our CEO Bruce Usher who figured this out, which was that instead of basically just taking a piece of it and trying to sell forward, we should basically put ourselves in the middle like a commodity trader, like a Cargill, basically, and just basically, assume that we had the best refinery of credits in the world, which we did. Okay, we registered the first project, we registered the first methodology, and we issued the first tons in the CDM, and all those are 3 different projects. So, again, we knew we could do that. So, in early 2005, I take a call from a colleague who'd been at one of the accountancy firms. I think he was PwC, and he'd gone to a boutique bank in London, and he calls me up. It's like 7 a.m, California, he's in London. He says, I think we can take you public. And I literally burst out laughing. I was like, that's the stupidest idea I've ever heard. There's no way we're going to be a public company. 9-10 months later, we've gone public on the LSE. In the interim, we did our first actual external raise with Cargill and a private equity firm called Marshall Street Management in like June of 2005, at a valuation that we then eclipsed by about 10x, going public in London in December of 2005. So we take it public in 2005. At this juncture, we're still we're growing a little bit. We're call it Q4 of 2005. We're still 25 people. By early 2007, we're 300 people. Okay, we had just we set up a gigantic origination platform. The line I've used many times is we had 16 offices in 12 time zones around the world. If there was then again, and I was, quite literally on the 250 to 300,000 mile a year diet for those 4 years, basically. Just, there was just things you had to do. Something, there's an event in Santiago. They need a senior person. There's an EB meeting. You have to make it to this. We're having a senior meeting in Beijing. We have to go to that. There's a problem in the Jakarta office. Somebody has to deal with that. And we're just, you're running like crazy. But we were literally, we set up the preeminent, global acquisition platform and to feed that refinery that we were building primarily in Oxford and to some degree in China later on. I mean, ultimately the refinery was sort of had 2 points and a little bit in Brazil as well, but mostly Oxford. And so, yeah, I mean, again, it was like you have no idea how hard you can run until you are basically told, go run. And, there's a line I heard 10 years later, which was Sheryl Sandberg's line, which is when somebody offers you a seat on a rocket ship, don't ask what seat it is. And I had a really good seat. Let's be very clear. I had one of the absolutely best seats, but it was a rocket ship and it was just kind of insane. I mean, there are stories there that really do require drinks to be told and cannot be told in public forum.
All right, challenge accepted. Let's do this on Carbon Exposure Project.
Fair enough.
Good one. Okay, cool. Sorry, Eddie, back to you.
So does that help you with basically the trajectory to JP Morgan, basically? I mean,
yeah, that's a trajectory to JP Morgan, but then JP Morgan takes you guys out,
well,
right? And also
there's
takes out climate
between.
care, and there's something in between. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know about climate care. That's past. That's after my time. So basically,
That's what you're talking about.
so basically, in the middle, we did a secondary with Credit Suisse in the middle of 2007, right at the peak of the market. I mean, if nothing else, we had really good market timing, because literally the first tremblings of the great financial crisis were happening like 4 or 6 weeks after we did that. So Credit Suisse comes in and basically buys a 10% stake in the company, and we end up with a strategic relationship. And we do, again, at that point, I think we were valued at, close to $1 billion. I mean, not quite, but in that neighborhood. Maybe one day we peaked over that. And then basically the CDM, remember I told you that, that issuances went down. Well, the timeline on issuances went down. We suffered, we tracked two things, which were, financials and commodities. And you can tell me how those did from 2007 to 2009. Okay. And, again, from a stock price of around, £3.70, our nadir, 16 months later was 16 pence. Okay. When the market decides they hate you, I mean, it's great when the market loves you, but then when the market decides they hate you, I mean, we were literally trading for about half the cash we had net in the bank after all our liabilities and options. It was insane. So, I mean, at that point, we said, well, we should just buy this thing back at this point because it's kind of absurd. And that's very hard to do. So Pedro at that point left the company and made a run at the company with a Brazilian investment bank called BTG Pactual. And then we basically ginned up an auction with a number of groups that came in, and ultimately, Electricité de France was in there. One of our other competitors at the time was in there, a private equity firm, but ultimately JP Morgan, who had fallen out of the transaction that we had done, the Credit Suisse one, fallen out a little bit earlier. We had a competitive process with Credit Suisse up until the very end. 24 hours before Credit Suisse won it, I thought Goldman Sachs was going to be our strategic investor, but Credit Suisse, gave a better bid. So in the end, basically, we ended up, sort of getting out alive, nowhere nearly our high. What I've said is 6 times our low and a quarter of our high, and both that have happened in the previous 20 months. Kind of insane.
That's a roller coaster right there.
Yeah, I tell my financial advisor I'm okay with it. Volatility.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and the first time that we spoke in San Francisco, I remember you said how the voluntary carbon market is an art market, not a commodity market, right? And I think I would love to just talk about that and hear let the audience hear your explanation for that, right?
Well, I mean, essentially, there are it's a discretionary income market, basically. People are doing, people buy art or they buy vacations or they buy expensive designer wear because of how it makes them feel and the storytelling they can tell about it, basically. And that's what I view a lot of the voluntary market to be. I mean, again, I believe that there have to be compliance markets. I believe that there are values that can be expressed in part of a compliance, that you don't have to just be looking for the purest, cheapest ton of carbon that you can get. I mean, if you want to be, I mean, again, and there are, firms that have large emissions that have very low margins, and they're not going to be spending on art carbon basically. But it comes down to the fact that, that the voluntary market by definition is the use of discretionary capital, not capital that you need to stay in business. And I think that ultimately, if we're going to be addressing the climate crisis, we need to be putting a price on emissions, and that price of emissions means that you need to have enough emissions rights within your portfolio to actually run your business. Right now, a voluntary market doesn't do that. A voluntary market lets you tell stories about what you're doing, lets you feel good about yourself, whether you're an individual, whether you're an organization, whether you're a corporate. And I think that's I think there's a lot of value to that. And the reality is we never expected when we set up the voluntary carbon standard, which was the original name in 2007. We never expected that this was going to last forever. We honestly thought it was going to last 5 to 7 years. Okay, because the compliance markets, of the trajectory from Kyoto to The Hague to Bali to ultimately Copenhagen, and Copenhagen is where it all fell off the wheels, was going to basically create larger and larger parts of the economy that were covered, of the global economy, that were covered by cap and trade. And the notion of credits from outside of that and experimentation was going to become much less necessary. So we set it up to be, as I say, I think the word we used is a sandbox for playing around for a while the world got its policy act together to create real constrictions on carbon, which is what I ultimately think you need. So Eddie, I've gone around a little bit there, and I apologize, but does that help you explain why I call this an art market? Because if you don't have to own it, you can choose to own it, and you can choose to not own it. And if suddenly you're having a bad quarter, you can choose to not buy.
Yeah, certainly. And also the fact that in traditional commodity markets like coffee or orange juice, etc., people buy for the lowest price. I mean,
absolutely. Yeah.
Right? And in this market, it's actually almost frowned upon if you buy the cheapest credits.
Exactly.
Signal of integrity and quality that starts to get into it, right? But yeah, it's voluntary versus compliance.
And the whole point of emission trading is to drive down the cost of compliance. That is the literal point of it. Again, it's not to send money to deserving projects in the emerging markets. Again, it's a nice co-benefit that we can have, and I do think that the CDM and the notion of creating these sort of additional pathways for creating value out of reducing emissions in multiple parts of the economy are very valuable. And some of those will have very good stories behind them, and there will be buyers that want to associate themselves with those stories. But I'd like that to be in the context of, I need enough of this stuff so that I don't get arrested next month because I'm not in compliance with my obligations to whatever law it is in my country to meet my emission standard.
So can I pick up on that thread, Mark?
Sure.
So obviously, and I want to go back to also kind of to the beginning of the genesis of EcoSecurities, and then kind of the spinning out, let's say, of Vera and your role there. But picking up on the compliance piece, right now we're at this intersection between compliance markets and voluntary markets, right? And this sandbox of innovation that was the voluntary carbon markets have actually been really fertile in terms of a lot of the methodology development.
100%.
Certainly.
100%.
And now that's being recognized and being essentially co-opted by the next generation of compliance systems. And as we look at Article 6 and the implementation of Article 6, especially under Article 6.2 in a number of different places, there's a pathway now here for the certifying bodies that were purely voluntary, Vera, Gold Standard, and others, to actually play a role. So there's this inherent evolution that goes from voluntary art market, not necessary, but nice to have, great storytelling, etc. And then, like as you said, the tide goes out with demand, but then it comes back in with demand. And now we're seeing this intersection with compliance. Do you see it to be sticky this time around? essentially.
I'll
That's
let you know in 10 years, man. Okay. Again, is the world going to take this, the problem seriously? I mean, I'd say that, going back to the real origin story, the 97, 2005, that was, when people were doing projects at that time, it was not purely for storytelling. People were also trying to arbitrage. People were like saying, if some of these, things I'm buying now ultimately turn out to be valuable in the future compliance market, it's a win. And I would argue that the boom we saw sort of in 2017 to 2021, I would say that part of that was also people thinking that there was an arbitrage,
there
basically
was
that they
massive
could buy.
arbitrage.
Yeah, that it was, that you were arbitraging, this sort of, fuzzy, voluntary, this is nice market. But, when real things start coming in, I'm going to be able to potentially shove some of those into a much higher value, much higher value market. So I think we're, and the complexities of 6.2 are, I'm not the person to really speak to a deep detail about that, but I think we're seeing the sort of the same thing on a slightly different framework. I think you framed it very well, Rene, which is that people are now really seeing that there is an overt overlap between things like Corsia, things like Article 6, and the various standards, Vera, Gold Standard, et cetera. And so there's more of a built bridge there than I think there was in 97 to 2004, or there was in 17 to 21, where we really were sort of like hoping there would be. And now you're seeing, the bridge is not entirely built, but it's being built from both sides, reasonably well. And you can sort of, picture in your mind what it's going to look like.
Yeah. Interesting, but I think
I don't know
there's
if I
this
answered your
number of
question there,
themes
but
that no, you did, certainly did. But like, it's interesting because a lot of the times when we speak with folks on the project side, it tends to be this very puritanical view of carbon markets around impact, and that's their lens that they look through. But yours is really sanguine in terms of talking about arbitrage, the need for speculation, and the need for trading,
yeah,
which is near and dear to my heart because that's really the lifeblood of markets, right? And needs to be a market, right? And for there to be
yeah,
liquidity, there needs to be the speculation potential. I sat in a very sort of virtuous position in that apex, right? As you talked about, that 2017 to sort of 2021, 22 kind of
yeah,
boom cycle by codifying what was being traded at the time and into standardized instruments. And that led to participation from a number of new actors, particularly financial intermediaries who are then coming into this market with a view for potential arbitrage, right, long term. As they saw
yeah.
that the tailwinds were really, really strong, those tailwinds turned into headwinds, and then obviously they retreated. But I think that now it's this kind of repeat boom and bust cycle. We're coming
Yeah.
back into that, and we're seeing the emergence or re-emergence of a number of these financial intermediaries coming back into these markets because they see inevitability of compliance demand and signals starting to come in as a result of Article 6, and then how countries effectively start to pass that signal down through to various different parts of the economy. So it's an interesting time to sort of hear the history and learn as many lessons from it as possible.
And that's where the rubber is going to meet the road, Rene. Which is, again, we have great intentions. We had great intentions, with Kyoto and the ETS. We had great intentions throughout, and again, but ultimately the body politic of the world every time has been really faced to like, okay, we really need to cut emissions and really do this collectively and individually, has frankly spit the bit every time. And again, is it going to do that again? Because we have a war in Latin America, or we have a global economic recession, or whatever else it may be. Generally speaking, other variables just too often just take precedence, and we end up just continuing to emit more and more. The thing that makes you hopeful is that we now can produce electricity more cheaply with clean sources than dirty sources. We can now deliver a very large percentage of global transport with clean as opposed to dirty. So again, we've done some things that have made it far more viable than it was in 2009. I mean, reality was clean energy was not less expensive in 2009. Okay, it simply wasn't. Now it is. Now it is, and it's indisputably is at this point. So again, the reality is that emissions trading can really work on the more salient, challenging parts of the emissions economy, as opposed to, and assume, or I don't know if we assume, but policy itself can sort of work on how we deal with, the parts where we do have economically viable replacements at roughly the similar cost, particularly if you take cost of capital in. So, I'm optimistic for those reasons, but, emissions trading is still needed because there are huge parts of the economy that are never going to decarbonize, not going to, aviation. Let's be real here, okay? We all like flying around the world. It's one of the most valuable things we can do with a ton of emissions, without a doubt. Just simply look at the the willingness to pay for a ton of emissions of how much economic value is on an airplane on every flight, and it can tell you those emissions are the most valuable emissions in the world. Okay, and and they should be offset. It should be offset entirely because they can afford it because they are they're paying the most for that emissions of anybody else out there, basically. So, sorry, I'm rambling on.
No. It is a really important demand signal. So we're talking about hard to decarbonize industries, specifically within aviation, which is an area of my key focus for me and my team. Corsia has had its peaks and troughs, in certainly as it relates to the pilot phase, and now we're sort of in the final year of phase one and approaching a compliance market in 2027, and the demand side there is significant because that industry is not decarbonizing quickly enough. They've got four verticals, essentially: operational, technological, efficiencies, and then SAF, and then carbon credits. And the SAF side of things is just not scaling at the rate that they need to, and nor will it, because of various different input bottlenecks that they have with regards to feedstocks and the actual capex required to actually operationalize the development of even more SAF. And so that's an industry that's going to be finding itself extremely dependent on carbon credits to actually be able to have the social license to operate. And so we see a huge demand signal emerging long term from that sector, and they're still grappling with the supply quotient. That's an interesting market because it actually is the inverse of what you mentioned earlier on, Mark, where there's actually a dearth. There's a really lack of supply of eligible emission units under Corsia that's throttling the potential for this market right now in terms of liquidity. We see a short squeeze emerging, certainly in the medium to long term in Corsia currently,
like
just because of the design.
Or where do you see
we're actually seeing we actually see that at the end of phase one, to be very frank, at the end of 27, as there's this huge run on compliance, but that's predicated on essentially compliance, non-compliance penalties emerging in that short time frame. So assuming that those do emerge, then airlines will be forced to comply. And so that's the big assumption.
And that's the assumption we have to basically always wonder when the rubber meets the road, is that really going to happen, or are people going to do their best to politically lobby and weasel their way out?
And push that way out. Exactly. And that sets the cap essentially on the maximum potential for price. But certainly as it comes back to the speculation, we see a number of clients who are looking to go long essentially on eligible EEUs right now and start to build out that factory or that supply pipeline of eligible emission units to be able to meet that. And then there's another assumption, which is the continuation of the various different projects' eligibility into the compliance phase. And we're starting to see the first signs of that. So we think that those demand sort of sectors really stay strong long term for this market.
Good.
So kind of coming back into your your role here at Vera in terms of as the chairman, and I know you have a day job obviously at Allotrope, and we can talk about that if you want as well. But relevant to carbon, how are you seeing this kind of evolution? Because Vera's been through a very interesting sort of 5 or 6 years certainly. And you've stepped in as the chairman, and now you've got a new CEO. How are things in your mind shaping up?
It's a warning: never go out to the bathroom during a board meeting because they elect you chairman without you knowing. It's not a.
I'm sure that's not the case.
Something I sought, but I was convinced that it was the time to do it. Again, obviously, I am
You're the
last
longest acting board member.
I was part of the steering committee that created the voluntary carbon standard back in it was just sort of 2007, 18 in January of 2000, starting in the January of 2007. And
Same.
then, I went to a lunch at the AIDA meeting in Berlin in December of 2006, where I was getting put on the AIDA board. And all of a sudden, I was on the steering committee for the VCS because somebody said, "Do you want to do this?" I'm like, "Okay, I don't even know what it was." But yeah, so 18, there are 18 of us
You'd
sort
written
of,
the paper
took on.
back in 1994 on the
Yeah.
development of third-party verification.
Yeah, but again, exactly. I was like, oh, that's nice. But again, at this point, I'm not thinking about this. I'm 2006.
Mm.
I'm thinking about the CDM. I'm thinking about flying
EcoSecurities.
300,000 miles a year to everything else. There's just this little thing. I mean, we had EcoSecurities have very small voluntary carbon practice for companies like Yahoo and things like that at the time. We did a little bit. It was probably like 3% of our business or something like that, or less than that,
Yeah.
basically. But so I've been there, since the steering committee, and I was one of the people from the steering committee that was elected to the first board, and really did not expect to be here at this point. This is we put in term limits 8 years ago finally, and so I'm terming out in a year from this coming March, basically. So yeah, I mean, again, it's been going back to your question. It's been quite the ride. It's one of the most impossible markets to try to basically predict your issuances. I mean, for all of these years, we've never quite gotten it right year to year. We're always over or undershooting quite dramatically in our projections. And we're getting a little bit better now, but for years it was just like we'd have this, and because you don't really control the market. You're people like you're driving the market. No, we exist because people in the market want us to exist. Basically buyers and sellers want to have that confidence, or that intermediary that can count on confidence with confidence, basically. And we're there. Again, it creates a layer of respectability, or a layer of confidence, basically. Therefore, when we went through the troubles, starting that you referenced, it was pretty harsh. I won't say that we these the projects that were the most picked on, or rightfully so, were among the oldest projects in the portfolio, some of the earliest red projects in the entire portfolio. And again, we always talked about this. The VCS, when it was a volunteer, was talked about learning by doing. Okay, and but one of the things about learning by doing, if you establish a crediting period, basically, you have to, as Franz Stottenbach used to say, you must marry the baseline, and that's what you have to do, because otherwise, you can't just dynamic baseline that changes every year. Nobody's going to invest in that. So, and yeah, I mean, there were mistakes made a long time ago that ultimately came back to bite us, to bite the market, to bite particular players in the market quite dramatically. And that was harsh. I'd say one of the things that we did note was we were not battle ready when that came, to be perfectly blunt. We had never seen something like that. We did not have the comms kind of department that we have right now. We did not rallied the industry to help defend. We're talking about thousands of projects in our portfolio, and there are some problematic ones. Unfortunately, some of the more problematic ones tend to be some of the larger ones, or they were. Basically, and that gives a bit of an outsized problem. But there are thousands of really good projects doing really good things for development and for energy, et cetera, and that nobody pays any attention to because they're just fine, basically. But nobody talks about those. So one of the things I think I was personally disappointed by was just the complete silence of most of the industry in defending us. We just didn't get a whole. Everybody was like, it was pile on. It was either shut up or pile on, basically. Again, as I say, we're a nonprofit. Okay, we're not. People have this impression that we're a profit organization, and we did, as a nonprofit, during those boom years, make quite a bit of money. But and we had quite a reserve, and we've now spent down a whole bunch of that reserve, and basically in increasing all of our capabilities. In terms of basically creating digitizing the whole. I mean, let's be honest. Vera, up until fairly recently, was entirely based on PDFs, because the CDM was based on PDFs, okay? And the CDM was based upon earlier emissions trading systems. So we're dealing with architectures that go back to, frankly, the 90s in certain cases. And again, so we had no ability to really extract data out in the way we needed to. And that bit us in the ass. And we were not prepared. We should have had the industry far more aligned with us, knowing that we knew that the Guardian article was coming out. We didn't know what it was going to say, obviously, but we knew they were digging around, and there was knowing the Guardian, we knew it was going to be it was going to be probably something pretty salacious, but we were not prepared. And that was the biggest lesson we learned, is that our comms need to be much better, and our engagement with our allies in the industry needs to be much more. And I'd say you mentioned Mandy. I think that Mandy, our new CEO, we had David Antonioli for many years. He was obviously a dear friend of mine. I know you know him very well, Rene as well. And then we had Judith as a interim CEO. Mandy has just changed the climate around, both within the organization and outside the organization, extraordinarily. I mean, she is perfectly fit for that. I enjoy, again, I resisted being the chair again. I was chair back in 2014, I think, for 3 years or something like that. I resisted. I was like, you don't need another old white carbon guy, as the chair. And they said, we need. Sorry, there was that impression of the board, and it wasn't entirely inaccurate. And we've done a lot of work. We always did do work to try create our diversity in the board, but it's not the easiest thing to do. Honestly, it just really isn't. And we've had success with that. But Mandy has absolutely just changed the tenor of how the industry views us and how we view ourselves internally. And I have a great working relationship with her. It's a casual working relationship. We're WhatsApping each other in the middle of the night, things that might have to do with carbon or might have to do with rugby. Who knows? So that's been very gratifying, and I'm pleased to have taken the seat now. It was not something I sought, but I'm very pleased to be here. Did I answer your question or not?
You did, and you gave us a great story as well as that. Yeah, and look, and we've had Mandy on the show before, and we're really big supporters of her work, and as you say, viewed from an external perspective, since she's come in, she's taken the reins. She's really helped us create a steadfast organization with regards to Vera. And I've been critical in certain around ways that Vera can be improved. That's because we genuinely care, right? And I have to say, today the organization is in a much better position than it was 24 months ago, and it looks like to be in that going in that direction. Certainly, as I mentioned before, this kind of intersection with Article 6 is certainly, and Corsia and other markets, is an area that there's a lot of potential demand. And then the other bit that I say is, there's the emergence of the ICVCM created essentially a level playing field for other standards to emerge. Yep. And it's really interesting. We thought at one point that there may be this possibility that multiple different standards emerge and then there'll be a consolidation event. That hasn't yet happened. We've seen a number of standards emerge, certainly, but we've actually seen Vera come into ascension over the last sort of 12 months, and the market really rallying around it, certainly from a demand side. Vera still retains that preeminence with regards to the demand that the buyers seek. They seek Vera preferentially to any other standard in the market. And I think that that's a true testament to the structural integrity and the robustness of the methodologies. It's a very broad methodology set, so I know it's really difficult, but kudos to the team. They've been doing a good job.
I mean, again, we started doing things like suspending VVBs for underperformance. We started, we killed projects. We basically said projects that we have, the entire thing with the small scale rice, a couple years ago. We took on more of the role. Again, originally VCS was set up to be fairly asset light, to really basically to trust the validators and the verifiers to be, to do their jobs. At that point, back in 2008, 2009, these were, validators were companies like DNV and TÜV and SGS, that had huge global franchises in trade certification, basically. And the reality is that in the 2015 to 2023 range, those guys weren't really in the market anymore. They'd all pulled out because
they left.
And so you had sort of one trick pony shops that are all about carbon verification. You have a market that's really your price, your buyers are definitely price sensitive. When a CFO is presented with two projects and one is $5 a ton and the other is $10 a ton, nobody can tell him exactly what the difference is. Okay, but you should do one of them. What's he going to do? He's going to do 5. So there's a lot of price pushing on that, and frankly, we had seen for a while some very, very, very underperformance by VVBs, but hadn't really had the capability to create the kind of sanction that we started doing basically. And again, we took on more and more the CDM executive board role from 20 years ago. And the irony is, as you said, you've been critical. 18 years ago, 19 years ago, I was you, Rene, basically screaming at the executive board at every forum I could possibly do because we were just dealing with minutia. The word materiality was something I probably uttered in every third sentence when it came to discussions around how calculations need to be done. I'm like, we don't need to get to a fourth decimal point. Just haircut me 10% and let's be done with this. Okay.
Yeah,
As
it's
I say,
pragmatism 101.
projects are taking hundreds of days to get through, and I'm burning money every one of those days. I'd rather just basically, hey, we don't know and we never will know, but let's just take a conservative number. But too many people, as I say, as you said earlier, there are too many purists out there that believe that there is actually a truth to this. And while there is a vector of truth, getting to an exact number on any of this stuff is purely dependent on the assumptions you make. There's just no two ways around that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to jump in here and ask about this challenge of like issuance delays, right? I think it's something that like project developers struggle with, like you said, hard to forecast and estimate, and especially when a lot of capital is on the line. How do you think the market solves that challenge of these very long?
Well, I mean, issuance. I mean, again, our data is that that everything that was extraordinarily bad several years ago is getting better. Where things are moving faster, there are exceptions to the rules. Okay, I have one friend who is a project developer who, there's a bell curve in every single sample size. And unfortunately, this friend of mine is one end of the bell curve. While I can look at him and tell him, our statistics show us that the vast majority of our projects are getting through the system better and with less friction than they were. He was on the bell curve, and all I could do was sort of apologize. It's not really something you say. How does the market solve for
like
dealing with
digitalization or AI play a
Yeah.
role?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, again, we're digitization is something we're deeply into. AI is something we are getting ourselves into. We do not have indigenous AI expertise within the organization, but we're working on that right now. We're working on, frankly, finding a board member or two that have real AI experience to help us through this. There's a whole lot of different ways the AI impact this, including, basically, how developers are writing PDDs. Again, scanning for that and making sure. I can tell you that, from the old days, we saw, I won't name names, but VVBs who would cut and paste entire validation reports and in some case forget to find and replace. Okay, well, we can't have that repeated with AI basically. So we have to figure that out. But I think digitization will have a large impact over time to how quickly these things get through. At the same time, our job is to people always say, project developers are your clients, and yes, they do pay us. I get that, but client is not the right word because we're a nonprofit. Okay, my primary client is the United States Internal Revenue Service, basically to make sure I'm not wasting the U.S. taxpayers' money on our nonprofit status, and my second client is actually the atmosphere because we need these things. There needs to be fidelity to these things, and so quality has to be first thing, and so. As much as efficiency as we can get, and I think there are a lot of technologies that are going to make this happen. Ultimately, they have to take backseat to making sure that credits that are issued are unimpeachable or as unimpeachable as they can be. And so I think we're good. We're doing well on that, but. Again, it's a work in process. And, again, for years when we were running so hard, there was, when, the market was basically almost doubling every year and we're operating in a ocean of PDFs. There was no way to basically do this. So actually, the downturn actually gave us a little bit of time to actually do these improvements.
Yeah. And you mentioned quality. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the role of the third-party ratings on carbon projects, right? Because it looks like the industry values these third-party ratings, such as B0 Carbon or Calyx Global. I'm curious to hear your views.
I'm always a little bit confused by the ratings agency. Again, this may be my, I've had some good, I obviously know several of them, reasonably well, but not, be bluntly, I'm not really in the carbon market other than my role at Vera. That may be changing with Allotrope in the next year or two, but right now, I'm not dealing with VVBs on a day-to-day or any basis. I'm not dealing with agency, but I have conversations, and to me, again, I go back to, I want this to be a commodity market. Okay, and a commodity market means there is a minimum standard. And if you meet the minimum standard, it is a ton. I can't believe I've quoted him now 3 times in this. Franz Tottenbach used to say, a ton is a ton is a ton. Okay, and which meant a CDM ton was worth the same as a EU ETS ton minus a very small fraction because of certain percentages. But the notion, my concern with the ratings agencies is that they facilitate the idea that there are 31 flavors of carbon, and that there are different qualities of carbon, and that again, it gets away from the commodification. I believe standards should be there for creating commodities. Ratings agencies should be there to rate the likelihood of a project to produce that commodity. Just like a rating agency grades the likelihood of a bond to produce dollars on a quarterly basis for my coupon, basically. And that's what ratings agencies do. It should not be telling me that my dollars are the wrong color or the wrong size, or so that as I say, the more ratings agencies are into production, unless they are into creating or enhancing the notion that there are real qualitative differences between tons. That I'm challenged when I hear when I get that interpretation of rating agencies, that companies, again, I understand that right now because we're in a voluntary market, and ratings agencies help with reputational protection. I get that, but in the market we need to have, that should not be a rating agency format. Whatever the entity is, whether it's Vera, whether it's individual governments, whatever it is that is creating a ton that is tradable, that needs to be basically considered inviolate, and whatever other characteristics are about, we can talk about it all well, but those characteristics should not be meaningful in the valuation of that ton unless somebody has that themselves because they want to support cook stoves projects in West Africa. Great. I'm glad you're doing that. That's really good. You should be doing that. But ultimately, those tons should be really only worth what the commodity tons are equivalently. The storytelling tons are for your telling the story, not for your compliance.
Yeah. Can I follow on from that, Mark? Because I find this really intellectually interesting. I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. I think that they're reactive. So to your point, rating agencies have emerged because it's a purely voluntary market right now that's dominated through buyer preference and dominated because of reputational risk and protecting of that risk. And so buy side has said to rating agencies, tell me what I can invest in. What is my investable universe, essentially, that I can have the confidence from a reputational perspective to not end up in a news media article. So that's the kind of genesis of ratings in this market. But as the market intersects with compliance demand, to your point, I think that it's inevitable that we see the next wave of standardization in the market. And so I'll take a parallel from other commodity markets. When we look at oil, there are various different grades of oil, right?
100%, yeah.
But you have different benchmarks that have emerged. WTI and Brent crude in particular. Why? Because not because that's the best type of product, effectively, right? To kind of bring the parallel to carbon, but because it's a reference point that all parties can agree that that's the 100%. Reference price. What it creates is essentially a nexus, and then other types, in this case crude, but in carbon, can trade at basis spreads, some to the upside and some to the downside. And so the market, I think, is primed right now for the next generation of standardized instruments. And look, we're throwing our hat in the ring on that side and stay tuned on that side.
Can I push back just a little bit on that? I mean, those crudes are traded basically on the basis of, it's not just that the benchmark is sort of randomly created. It's created because the ability to extract, the particular product mix out of a particular, whether it's Bonnie Light or whether it's, WTI or whether it's Brent, as well as the physical requirement to get the crude to a refinery, basically. So credits are not exactly that. Okay, credits, we all know that there is zero cost to actually bring them to actually transport them, whatever they are. They're mathematical algorithms in the cloud.
Yeah,
Basically.
it's a digital certificate.
It's a digital asset, and so again,
there are costs associated with extraction from different regions, and so there's a fundamental sort of differentiation across the spectrum from nature-based to cooks those to others in terms of the actual generation of those credit types.
Yeah, but that is ultimately, whoever wants to produce into the market, basically, if you're underneath, Saudi punches oil out of the Gawar at at $3 a barrel lift, basically, and so they're profitable no matter where you are, and that might be right. Whereas the Permian is turning on wells on and off according to what the price is every day, basically. So basically you're producing if you can produce at a price that is underneath the price you can sell it for, less the transaction costs to or plus the transaction cost to bring it to market. As I say, we don't need super tankers to move carbon credits around. So I'm not exactly sure. I think we're somewhat aligned to Rene on this, but I think this is a conversation for a bar.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's okay. But let's separate that from physical commodities to digital commodities, right? Ultimately, I think we're aligned in seeing that this market emerges as a commodities market. Why? Because commodity markets have got an underlying demand signal. So coming back to that original point that you made, so if we see that underlying demand being consistent, right, there will be ups and downs nonetheless in terms of the volatility. But as long as the demand remains consistent, coming from compliance signals, we think that in the next generation of standardized contracts emerge, and there will be some innovation in and around the space.
Yeah.
We're throwing
I can see that. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I got it.
And then whichever standardized contract emerges to become the benchmark, then that becomes that reference price that other contracts or other credits can trade against, right? And I think that that's the next evolution over the next 5 to 10 years, if I was to look into my crystal ball.
I can see that.
And obviously, you've got ICE with their Corsia contract, now the ball's in their court to see what happens around Corsia and other types of contracts. But I think these financial markets will necessitate that there's a financially settled futures contract for carbon. And then that's going to be driven purely by the packer, in my view, right? And what flows from that, if I was to look into that crystal ball, right? It's Corsia and Packham in my mind. Yeah. Cool. All right, Eddie, back to you. Sorry for that segue.
No worries. It's a great conversation to be had. It started with ratings, then led into a discussion about the commodity market themselves. With that being said, you mentioned how you're not really in the carbon space, so maybe it'd be interesting to hear about your work at Allotrope Partners as kind of in low, because I think you're in kind of low carbon infrastructure investments.
Yeah,
now, right?
Exactly. Yeah,
and I think that's more correlated to what I'm seeing, at least in the insetting market.
Yeah.
So
that's exactly what we're doing. We work with largely in Southeast Asia. We work with large corporates that are looking to decarbonize their supply chains, and that's a very complex thing to do because they don't necessarily own their own factories. They're contracting with other parties and things like that. So our aim is we are effectively creating solar energy and battery storage development platforms for things like industrial parks. In the Philippines, we're actually doing it more with electric cooperatives, but also with some CNI. And you're absolutely right. It's basically it's internal reductions, and we do think that there continues to be, both in the voluntary market and in the future compliance markets, that decarbonizing your own supply chains is going to be super important. But we also recognize that when we deal with, our clients have included, most of the large, tech companies, a whole lot of the large, high-end apparel / outdoor equipment industries, things along those lines. Generally, things that have large margins and can afford to make sure. But the reality is, we tend to be saving the money in many cases. Ultimately, it depends on how you can structure the financing and things along those lines. But that only deals with the electricity. And while you can do a lot more with electricity, and our aim, is to work with these, these platforms to, try to electrify more and more of their operations, there's a whole lot of inputs that cannot be electrified. Okay, and and that's where ultimately we see that, I've been looking around for a long time. There are a few ways you can decarbonize, direct heat provision, but it's not easy. I mean, you've got heat batteries coming out, but things like pellets and stuff like that just are not particularly effective ways to do that. I mean, again, let's be very clear. The one thing about fossil fuels is that they're bloody miracles. They work so well. They're stable. They give you energy when you want them.
And they're super high density, portable.
Super high density, yeah, it's portable. Again, they don't blow up on you, generally speaking. So it's a tall mountain to climb. And again, we've done it with electricity. We're doing it with, say, transport up to 300 kilometers at this point is probably a reasonable number. Probably a couple other things, but we see that our partners are ultimately going to need carbon performance, to get to their net zero objectives or whatever they may be. Yeah, so electricity is easy. Ultimately, we see transport as being easier, but and we see some opportunities for embedding lower carbon cement and things like that, that are really within the supply chains. But ultimately, there's going to be, you're going to run out of those things. And, it's a very different, as we said, the airline industry has virtually no options. The electricity industry has lots of options, and everybody else is in between. So, we ultimately think that the groups that we work with, the tech companies that you guys know, the apparel companies, all like that, are going to also want to have, access to carbon credits that are within the markets that they are participating in. If you're investing hundreds of millions of dollars into Vietnam, you want to stay on the right side of the Vietnamese government. Or if you're doing the same in Indonesia, you want to do this. And so you're going to look to try to make your carbon investments, whether they're compliance or whether they're voluntary, to be aligned with some of your business practices. It just makes sense. It's always been kind of that case, in the voluntary market. I mean, again, you're going to look for things that are, you want lowest cost, but you may have, most of these guys will have some strategic reasons to do at least some portion of their carbon compliance within markets that are important to their core business. Basically, we think that that's kind of a core. And so we're kind of edging our way into some opportunities in the markets that we work in ASEAN. And, our markets are really, we have one large asset that Rene knows about that we're working on in the United States, but everything else at this juncture is basically in ASEAN. So we're probably going to be doubling down on that, and both within, sort of the energy side, potentially within things like, low carbon cement and low carbon plastics and things along those lines, but ultimately credits. I don't see us ever really getting into things like nature-based solutions ourselves. It's just not in our DNA as an organization. We think, again, God bless everybody who does it. I want to save as much nature as possible, but we're interested in decarbonizing things with a P&L, basically, profit and loss statement.
Yeah, it's interesting because you mentioned electricity, the energy industry, and then transport, but agriculture, that's where it starts to get.
Yeah, that's right on the borderline. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, we're definitely, we're agriculture. I would consider business. Again, you can't go into big ag and think it's, it's. So yeah, we are looking at some agriculture projects as well, basically. But basically because we're interested in how entities that have commercial responsibilities to their shareholders, their owners, whatever it may be, can decarbonize effectively and either sell that decarbonization or buy decarbonization. So
thank you so much.
That was a masterclass. We really enjoyed it. Obviously, like you said, a third of a century in carbon.
Yeah.
Really found that fascinating.
This is my 33rd year. That's just starting my 33rd year.
Yeah, incredible. But it shows the longevity of this market, and obviously there are significant ups and downs and volatility in all markets. But it's really important for folks that are actual practitioners in the space to obviously learn from the lessons of the past. You've given us a sort of a window into some of those lessons, and I think that our listeners will take a lot of value from our conversation. So I really want to thank you for your time.
It was really fun. I do really appreciate the opportunity. Again, it's as I say, it's
You're
been
welcome
quite
back
the ride.
anytime.
What you guys do, it's really good. And Rene, we'll see. I'll see you in Singapore probably in a couple weeks.
Awesome. Look forward to it.
again. Thanks, guys.